I knew Diane Hargrove hated the weather station behind my house from the day she took the president's chair at our homeowners association. She called it ugly scrap metal, belonging to an old man playing scientist, and she ordered me to move it before Friday. I only asked her if she was sure. Diane laughed and told me that men like me always imagine we matter more than the community does. The next morning she arrived with her board, her attorney, and a removal crew in 2 loaded trucks. But before a single gloved hand touched the sensor mast, 3 county vehicles turned onto our street. If you enjoy watching a homeowners association dig its own hole with nothing but arrogance and a clipboard, subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the very end. My name is Desmond Avery. I am 52 years old, and I live alone at the last address in Briar Glen Estates, where the pavement stops and the land starts sloping down toward the creek bed. Behind my house, about 40 feet off the back corner of the lot, there is a galvanized mast roughly 10 feet tall, bolted into a concrete pad the size of a card table. Mounted along that mast are an anemometer, a wind vane, a temperature and humidity shield, a tipping bucket rain gauge, a barometric sensor housed in a weatherproof case, and a small gray telemetry box with a stubby antenna and a green light that blinks every few seconds. It is not attractive. Nobody has ever stood in my backyard and told me it improved the view. It makes no noise, throws no light at night beyond that one small blinking diode, and has never once bothered a neighbor. For 8 years, nobody in Briar Glen said a word about it. The previous board president was a retired mail carrier named Walter Prine, who knocked on my door exactly twice in 6 years, once to ask about a fallen limb and once to bring me a plate of ribs after his daughter's graduation party. Walter asked what the mast was. I told him. He nodded, and that was the whole conversation. The neighbors on either side, the Kramers and old Mrs. Delacroix, had lived beside it long enough that it had become part of the tree line to them. If you had asked anybody on my street to describe my backyard, most of them would have mentioned the shed before they mentioned the mast. That is, how invisible it was, right up until the night Diane Hargrove won her election with a slide presentation about property values and a promise to make our neighborhood look premium. I met her 3 days after the vote. She came up my driveway in a white sport utility vehicle with the engine still running and 2 board members trailing behind her like she had brought them along to hold her coat. She was maybe 48, in a pressed blazer on a Saturday morning, and she walked past my greeting the way you walk past a sign you have already decided not to read. She did not knock. She went straight around the side of the house to where the mast stood, put her hands on her hips, and looked up at the spinning cups of the anemometer, with an expression like she had found a raccoon in her pantry. Then she turned around and delivered the first words she ever said to me directly. "That thing has to go," she said. I asked her a simple question. I asked whether she had checked the records on it. I did not raise my voice, I did not fold my arms, and I did not tell her a single thing about what the equipment actually was, because in my experience, people who arrive already certain do not absorb information, they only look for gaps to argue into. Diane gave me a small, tight smile, the kind people use when they think patience is a favor they are doing you. She said she did not need to read any paperwork to know that a metal pole lowers home values. One of the board members behind her, a soft-spoken man named Ray Whitaker, actually glanced at the equipment case as if he was curious, and Diane kept talking right over the moment. She called it hobby equipment. She said the word hobby the way some people say the word clutter. Then she added something she probably thought was gracious, which was that men my age often need little projects to feel useful, and that she understood, she really did, but Briar Glen had standards now. I stood there on my own grass and let the sentence land, without flinching, because there is a particular kind of insult that tells you everything about the person delivering it, and nothing at all about you. I only said one thing back before they left, and I made sure to say it plainly enough that she could not later claim confusion. I told her I thought she ought to check the records before she signed anything. Diane heard that as a challenge. I watched it happen on her face, the way her chin lifted a quarter inch, and her eyes went flat and pleased. She said, "I'll keep that in mind," in the voice people use when they intend to do the exact opposite, and then she got back in her vehicle and drove down my street slowly the way an inspector drives. Ray Whitaker looked back at me once through the passenger window. I went inside, made coffee, and stood at my kitchen sink, watching the green light blink through the screen door, counting the seconds between pulses out of pure habit. I had spent 26 years as a telecommunications and remote instrumentation technician before my knees and the industry both changed on me, and I know exactly what an unexamined assumption costs when it is attached to authority. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived at my mailbox giving me 72 hours to remove or relocate the structure. The letter was 2 pages and cited 3 separate provisions of the Briar Glen Estates covenants. The first prohibited unapproved antennas and transmission apparatus. The second prohibited metal structures visible from common areas. The third was a general aesthetic clause about installations that detract from the architectural harmony of the community. I read all 3 twice at my kitchen table with a pencil in my hand, the same way I used to read specification sheets, and by the second pass I understood that Diane had a real problem and did not know it yet. The antenna clause exempted equipment installed pursuant to governmental authority. The metal structure clause applied to structures erected by an owner, and I had not erected anything. The aesthetic clause explicitly deferred to any recorded encumbrance running with the land, which is a phrase somebody wrote into those covenants in 1991 for exactly this kind of situation. I wrote Diane an email that evening, and I kept it deliberately short, because long explanations give people something to argue with, while short ones give them something to verify. I wrote that this equipment should not be moved, and that I was asking the association to review the county land records for my parcel before taking any action. I did not say the words easement, county, or emergency management. I have thought about that choice a lot since then, and I will be honest with you about my reasoning, because I do not want to pretend I was purely noble. Part of me knew that a woman who had already told me I was playing scientist would not believe a word I said about what the mast was, and would only believe a public document she found herself. The other part of me, the part that had already been called useless in my own backyard, wanted her to do the reading. Her reply came in 11 minutes and consisted of a single line telling me to attend the board meeting on Tuesday. The Briar Glen clubhouse smells like carpet shampoo and stale coffee, and they had arranged the folding chairs in rows facing a long table, where Diane sat dead center with a leather folder open in front of her. There were maybe 19 residents present, which was more than usual, because Diane had been sending out notices about enforcement all month, and people were nervous about their own fences and sheds. To her left sat Caleb Sloan, the association's attorney, a man around 44 with a good suit and the specific tiredness of somebody who bills by the hour for other people's grudges. To her right sat Ray Whitaker and a board member named Marla Dunn who took the minutes. I sat in the third row with a folder of my own that I did not open. Diane ran that meeting the way a person runs a room they believe they own. When my item came up, she read the violation notice aloud, and then she editorialized in a way I doubt appeared in Marla's minutes. She called the mast a toy. She called it a personal project. She used the phrase junkyard science and got a small ripple of laughter from 2 people near the back, and I watched her face brighten at the sound of it. Then she looked directly at me across 19 chairs and said, "Mr. Avery, knowing a few technical terms does not put you above the rules of this association." I let the room go quiet for about 3 seconds before I answered, because silence makes people listen harder than volume does. I never said I was above the rules, I told her. Then do what an adult does, Diane said. Take it down. Caleb Sloan shifted in his seat. I noticed it because I was watching him and not her, which is a habit I picked up in 26 years of meetings where the loudest person in the room was rarely the one who mattered. He had a legal pad in front of him and he had written maybe 4 words on it during the entire exchange. He had never seen a title report on my parcel because Diane had not given him one, and a lawyer who has not seen the documents cannot object to conclusions drawn from documents he has not seen. So he sat there while his client described a public safety installation as junkyard science, and he made a note, and he said nothing. I do not blame him for that exactly. I do blame him a little. Before I sat down, I said the second thing that I would later be very glad the minutes recorded. I told the board that if they intended to proceed, I would ask that every directive be issued in writing. Diane agreed instantly and almost cheerfully, and I understood why. She thought I was frightened. She thought a man asking for paper is a man building a shield, when in fact a man asking for paper is very often a man building a record. Marla wrote it down. Caleb did not look up. 4 days later, the association did not merely put its directives in writing. Diane signed and mailed a notice imposing a fine of $250 per day, accruing from that Friday forward until the structure was removed from my property. The notice bore her signature in blue ink, wide and confident, with the loop of the D running back under the whole name, like an underline she had drawn for herself. I did not pay it, and I did not answer it. What changed was that Diane started driving past my house, repeatedly, at different hours, slowing at the curve where you can see my back lot line. One afternoon, she stopped in the street with her window down, while I was crouched at the base of the mast, with the telemetry housing open. "What are you doing?" she called out. "Checking a connection," I said. She laughed at that. She actually laughed, one short syllable, and then she told me it did not matter, because next week it would not be here. I stayed crouched and kept my hands on the connector, because there is no version of standing up fast that improves that conversation. Then she offered me the piece of advice that I would think about many times in the weeks that followed. She said that I could put a weather application on my phone like a normal person. I said, "Yes, ma'am," and she drove off, and I finished torquing the connector to spec. I want to explain what she had never asked about, because this is where the whole thing actually starts. Roughly 8 years before any of this, the County Emergency Management Office had a problem with its West Valley data. Their primary observations came from the regional airport station, which sits east of the ridgeline on flat open ground, and the terrain between here and there does something to weather that flat ground does not. Wind funnels down through the gap above the creek and accelerates. Rain cells stall against the slope and dump 3 inches on us while the airport gauge collects a 1/4 inch. Temperature inversions settle into the low ground on winter nights and hold there for hours after the official readings say the freeze has lifted. For fire weather, and for severe thunderstorm warnings, the difference between airport data and actual conditions on this side of the ridge was not academic. It was the difference between a warning issued at the right time and a warning issued at the wrong one. They needed an observation point on the west slope with power, an unobstructed exposure, and a landowner willing to sign. My back lot line sat almost exactly on the spot their siting analysis wanted. A man named Doyle from the county came out with a survey crew and a folder, and we walked the property together for 2 hours in August heat while he explained what they needed and what they would pay for. The county drew up an agreement covering a small defined area of my land, and then they recorded something in the county land records that a great many people have never heard of and that Diane Hargrove had specifically decided she did not need to read. It is called a Public Safety Instrumentation and Access Easement, and it runs with the land, which means it does not care who owns the parcel, who runs the neighborhood association, or how anybody feels about the appearance of galvanized steel. I want to be clear about what I am and what I am not, because people hear this story and want me to be secretly powerful, and I was not. I do not own that equipment. The county owns every bolt of it. I am not a county employee, and I never have been. What I am is a property owner who granted an easement, plus one line in a maintenance addendum saying that the resident may perform basic visual inspection connector checks at county request, which is in there purely because I happen to have 30 years of relevant certification, and Doyle thought it was silly to send a truck 40 minutes for something I could look at in 4. For that, I receive nothing except a small annual consideration that works out to less than my water bill and the quiet satisfaction of a man who spent his career making sure signals arrived where they were supposed to arrive. That deed and that easement sat in a fireproof box in my hall closet the entire time, along with the recording stamp and the reference number that would let anyone with an internet connection pull the same documents from the county clerk in about 90 seconds. I took the folder out the night. The fine notice arrived, laid every page on the kitchen table, photographed all of it, and then put it back in the box. I did not send it. I have been asked whether that was a trap, and my answer is no, and I want to defend that answer. A trap is when you conceal the path. I had told Diane Hargrove twice, in person and in writing, exactly where to look, and the place I told her to look was a public record available to any member of the public, including her. I was not hiding the door. I was declining to carry her through it. The weather turned that same week, which is the part of this that still makes the back of my neck feel strange. Not a disaster, nothing biblical, just a broad upper-level trough sliding east faster than the models had first suggested, with a line of storms forecast to organize along a cold front and cross our county the following afternoon. I knew because I read the discussion products the way other men read box scores, and because Station 14 was telling the story in numbers before the sky told it in color. Pressure falling steadily across 36 hours. Dew points climbing. Wind backing around from the southeast and picking up in the low ground where it usually goes still at dusk. Nothing alarming on its own, and all of it pointing the same direction together. Tessa Monroe called me Thursday afternoon at 4:20. She is the county meteorologist who has handled the West Valley data for the last 5 years, 39 years old. Direct on the phone, no wasted syllables. She asked whether Station 14 was operating normally, because she was seeing a clean feed and wanted to confirm the hardware was healthy before the front arrived. I told her the feed was good, that I had reseated a connector 2 weeks back after an intermittent dip, and that the rain gauge had been cleared of leaf litter on Sunday. She thanked me and started to wrap up the call the way people do when the answer was the one they expected. Then I asked her a question I had been turning over for 2 days. What happens if somebody intends to move the station? I said. There was a silence on that line long enough that I checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. When Tessa came back, her voice had changed register entirely, and every trace of routine had gone out of it. She asked me who intended to move it. I told her that I would rather show her than tell her, and I forwarded the entire file within 4 minutes. The initial violation letter, my 2 written warnings, the meeting notice, the fine notice with Diane's signature, and the community bulletin naming the removal contractor and the Friday morning hour. Then I sat on my back step with the phone in my hand and watched the cups on the anemometer turn faster than they had turned all week. Tessa's reply came in 19 minutes and contained 2 sentences. She told me not to interfere physically with anyone, under any circumstances, and she told me she was escalating it. I wrote back a single word, which was understood, and then I did nothing else, because in my whole career, the fastest way to turn a procedural problem into a personal one was to put your own hands on somebody else's mistake. Meanwhile, Diane sent a second bulletin to the entire community that evening. She wrote that the association was addressing an unapproved structure in order to protect property values, and she added a line saying that no single homeowner stands above the rules that all of us agreed to. I read that line 4 times on my phone in the blue light of my kitchen, and I want to tell you I felt something dramatic, but mostly what I felt was tired, and underneath the tired, a small dark spark of anticipation I am not entirely proud of. Friday morning was clear and unnaturally still, the way it sometimes is on the front side of a system, with a high thin haze and air that felt like it was holding its breath. The first truck rolled onto my street at 7:40. It was a flatbed with Clearview Landscape and Removal painted on the door, towing a trailer with a small excavator strapped down, followed by a pickup carrying 2 men and a rack of tools. Diane arrived 90 seconds behind them in the white sport utility vehicle and parked square across the mouth of my driveway, which I noted at the time and mentioned to nobody. Caleb Sloan pulled in behind her in a gray sedan and sat inside it for a full minute before getting out. Ray Whitaker and Marla Dunn came in a third car. And from the way they stood near the curb with their hands at their sides, I understood they had been brought as witnesses and were not entirely happy about it. I walked out my front door with a travel mug of coffee, which I want to note was not a performance, because it was 7:40 in the morning and I had made coffee. Diane came up the driveway holding a folder against her chest with both arms, and she stopped about 8 feet from me, which I think she believed was an assertive distance. She said, "The deadline has passed." I said good morning to her, and then I said good morning to Ray, who said it back before he could stop himself, and then looked at the ground. The 2 men from Clearview had gotten out and were standing at the tailgate pulling on gloves, watching all of it with the flat, professional patience of people who have arrived in the middle of somebody else's argument before. I did not stand in front of the mast. I did not put a hand on anything or anybody, and I did not raise my voice at any point that morning, which matters for what happened afterward. Instead, I walked over to the 2 contractors, introduced myself by name, and asked them one question. I asked whether anyone had informed them that the equipment they had been hired to remove might be part of a public safety system. Both men stopped what they were doing. The older one, who had a company logo on his cap and about 20 years on his hands, looked past me at Diane and said, "Ma'am?" Diane was there before he finished the syllable. "Don't listen to him," she said. "This is property within the association, and the board has authorized abatement." I'd ask everyone to read the placard on the control housing before anything else happens, I said. There is a stainless plate riveted to the front of the gray telemetry box, 4 inches by 6, with lettering deep enough to read from 10 feet in good light. It says Property of Kankakee Emergency Management, and underneath that it says Station 14, and underneath that there is a phone number and an installation reference code. Diane walked over, looked at it for perhaps 2 seconds, and announced that it was an old label. That is what she said, an old label. She said it in the same tone she had used to say hobby equipment, and I realized, standing there in my own driveway, that she had constructed a version of me so complete in her mind that a riveted steel placard from a county agency could not survive contact with it. Caleb Sloan read the placard too, and Caleb did not say it was an old label. He took his glasses off, put them back on, and turned to Diane with a question I could hear from 15 feet away. He asked her whether she was certain the association had reviewed a title report on this parcel. It was the first competent thing anyone from the association had done in 5 weeks, and it came about 4 minutes too late. Diane snapped at him without turning her head. She said, "Caleb, don't let him stretch this out." Then she looked over at the 2 men in gloves, lifted her chin, and gave the order that I suspect she will be hearing in her own voice for the rest of her life. "Move that weather station," she said. The older contractor hesitated for maybe 3 seconds and then did what men do when the person writing the check has spoken and the person objecting is not their client. He walked to the base of the mast, crouched, and unlatched the protective cage that surrounds the lower junction and the concrete anchor bolts. The cage door is on a hinge with a magnetic contact, and the mast itself carries a 3-axis accelerometer. Because county equipment installed on private land in remote positions gets tamper monitoring as a matter of standard practice. The instant that cage swung open and the man put a pry bar against the anchor plate to test it, the mast registered lateral movement outside its threshold. None of us standing in that driveway heard a sound. 22 miles east, in a room with a wall of monitors, an alert posted on a board with a red field and a station number, and somebody picked up a telephone. I looked at my watch at 8:19 when I saw the first county vehicle turn onto Briar Glen Drive. There were 3 of them in a line, moving at a deliberate speed that was somehow more unsettling than lights and sirens would have been. A white pickup with an amber bar and a county seal on the door. Behind it, a dark utility vehicle. Behind that, a van with equipment racks visible through the rear glass. They came up the length of the street, past the mailboxes and the young maples the association had planted last spring, and every person in my driveway turned to watch them come, and nobody said one word. The man who got out of the second vehicle was 57 years old, gray at the temples, wearing a polo shirt with the county emergency management crest and khakis, and he did not hurry. That is what I remember most clearly about Grant Ellison. He shut his door, took in the entire scene in one slow sweep: the flatbed, the excavator on the trailer, the 2 men in gloves, the open cage at the base of the mast, and only then did he start walking. Tessa Monroe came around from the passenger side with a tablet under her arm and went straight past everyone to the equipment without acknowledging a single human being present. A third technician followed her, carrying a hard case. Diane got to Grant first. I am convinced she believed at that moment that I had called them, that this was a bluff I had arranged to frighten the association, and that she was about to explain the situation to a public employee and send him on his way. She put out her hand and said, "I'm Diane Hargrove, president of the Briar Glen Estates Homeowners Association. This is an internal community matter." Grant did not take the hand. He said, "It stopped being an internal matter at 8:16 this morning." Then he walked around her and went to the station. He crouched at the base and looked at the open cage without touching it. He checked the anchor plate, the pry marks where the bar had bitten into the galvanizing, the conduit run, the ground strap, and the seal on the telemetry housing. Tessa had already brought the diagnostic up on her tablet and was reading numbers to him in a low, flat voice, and the third technician was photographing the cage, the bolts, and the tool marks from 4 angles with a ruler in frame. Nobody in my driveway had ever seen anything documented that way, and you could feel the temperature of the whole gathering change while it happened. Then Grant straightened up, turned around, and asked the room a question. "Who gave the order to move Station 14? Nobody answered. Ray Whitaker looked at Marla Dunn. The contractor with the pry bar had quietly set it down on the grass. Caleb Sloan was standing very still with his folder closed against his leg, and I understood from his face that he had already worked out most of what was coming, and was performing rapid arithmetic on his own exposure. I did not say anything either. I only looked at Diane, and after a few seconds, everyone else in that driveway followed my eyes to her, which is a thing that happens to people who spend a great deal of energy making sure a room knows they are in charge of it. "The association gave the order," Diane said. "The installation violates our architectural covenants." Grant let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "The Homeowners Association is directing the county to relocate emergency warning instrumentation." He did not say it as an accusation. He said it as a clarification, the way you repeat an address back to somebody to make sure you wrote it down right. And that is precisely what made it devastating. Diane's face went through 3 separate expressions in about 2 seconds. Then she pivoted, and she did it so smoothly that I almost admired the reflex. She said she had been under the impression the equipment belonged to Mr. Avery personally. She said the association had received complaints. She said nobody had ever informed the board of any county involvement, and she said that last part with real heat because she had found the story she was going to tell, and she had decided to believe it on the spot. "Has Mr. Avery provided you with documentation?" Grant asked her. "He refused to cooperate," Diane said. "I had my phone in my hand already. I read the first email out loud, dated 5 weeks earlier, in which I asked the association to review the county land records for my parcel before taking action. Then I read the second one, sent after the board meeting, in which I repeated the request and added that I would be preserving all correspondence. Then I said, out loud in front of Ray and Marla and Caleb and 2 contractors and 3 county employees, that I had also told her the same thing standing in my own backyard the first day she came, before any of it was in writing." Grant listened to all of it without changing expression, then turned to Tessa and asked her to pull the parcel record. Tessa had it up before he finished asking. She turned the tablet around so that Caleb Sloan could see it first, which I do not think was an accident. The document header read Public Safety Instrumentation and Access Easement, with the parcel number, the meets and bounds of the easement area, the county clerk's recording stamp, the book and page, and a date more than 3 years before Diane Hargrove ever ran for the board. Under it was the maintenance and access agreement with my signature and Doyle's. Caleb read it for a long time. Then he handed the tablet back to Tessa without a word and looked at the grass, and I watched an attorney silently reorganize his entire understanding of who his client was. Grant delivered the next part quietly, which somehow made it land harder than volume ever could have. He said that the equipment currently had a pry bar mark on its anchor plate, that it was feeding real-time observations to the County Operations Center, and that a line of strong storms was expected to move into the western half of the county within roughly 6 hours. He said the West Valley has no other surface observation between the ridge and the state line, and that the airport data does not represent conditions on this slope. He said all of that in about 4 sentences, using no adjectives at all. Diane was not smiling anymore. She had her folder pressed against her chest with both arms again, and for the first time since I had met her, she was not the person deciding what the conversation was about. I thought that was the end of it. It was not, and the second half was worse for her than the first, because the first half was about something she had failed to read, and the second half was about something she had personally built. Grant asked Tessa to walk the access route, which is a 15-foot service corridor running from the end of the cul-de-sac along the rear of 3 lots to the concrete pad, established in the same recorded instrument, so that county trucks can reach the station without crossing anyone's driveway. Tessa took the technician and went. They were gone about 7 minutes. When they came back, Tessa's face had the specific tightness of somebody delivering news she already knows is going to make her morning longer. "The corridor's obstructed," she said. "There's decorative fencing across it at 2 points, a landscape gate with a masonry pier, and 3 stone planters set inside the easement area. Gate opening measures about 6 feet. We need 12 to bring the service truck through." Grant asked who approved the gate. There was a pause, and then Ray Whitaker said, very quietly, "Diane did." Marla Dunn nodded, and added that the president had authorized it under the discretionary appearance budget without a full board vote, and she said it in the flat voice of a secretary who keeps minutes and has been waiting a long time for somebody to ask her a direct question. Diane said something about how the entire board had seen the rendering. Nobody backed her up. "Then we have 2 matters today," Grant said. "Interference with Station 14 and obstruction of a recorded emergency access easement. The second one predates this morning by several months." Diane tried once more, and I understood by then that she genuinely could not conceive of an outcome in which none of this was my fault. She turned toward me and started a sentence with the words if he had simply explained himself properly from the beginning. That was the only time all morning I interrupted anyone. I said, "I told you to check the records 3 times. Then I stopped talking because I had counted them and the number was correct, and there was nothing to add to a correct number. Caleb Sloan confirmed it. That is the part I did not expect. He opened his folder, found the printed email chain that Diane herself had forwarded him weeks earlier as evidence of my non-compliance, and he read my 2 written warnings aloud in a lawyer's neutral cadence. Then he closed the folder and said something to Diane that I do not believe she anticipated in front of witnesses. He said, "I asked you directly whether there were any recorded encumbrances on this parcel before I drafted the violation letter." He did not say what she had answered. He did not have to, and the fact that he did not was the most professionally brutal thing I saw that day. The whole atmosphere in that driveway inverted. 5 weeks earlier, I had sat in a folding chair while a room laughed at the phrase junkyard science. Now the woman who had spent every one of those weeks positioning herself as the sole representative of rules and order in Briar Glen Estates was standing on my grass, trying to explain why she had not read the one document that would have prevented all of it. Nobody was laughing. Ray Whitaker had moved several feet away from her without seeming to notice he was doing it. The contractors were already walking back toward their trucks. Grant issued his instructions, and they were short. All removal activity ceased immediately, and the contractor was released. Station 14 remained in place, undisturbed, with the damage to the anchor plate documented for the county's records. County access to the corridor would be restored, and until the obstructions were removed, the association would be required to provide immediate on-demand access by any means necessary at its own cost, and the association's counsel would be contacting the county legal office that same day regarding the encroachments. He said all of it to Caleb rather than to Diane, which I noticed, and which I suspect Diane noticed too. Then Grant Ellison said the last thing he said that morning, and he said it looking directly at her, in the same unhurried voice he had used for everything else. "Mrs. Hargrove, Mr. Avery is not the person obstructing this community today." They were gone by 9:15. The flatbed backed out with the excavator still strapped down and never unloaded. Caleb left with his phone already at his ear, and Diane sat in her vehicle at the curb for a good 4 minutes before she pulled away. Tessa stayed behind another half hour to run a full diagnostic, and she told me the tamper alert had reached the operations center at 8:16 and 40 seconds. Then she said something I have thought about since. She said, "You know we would have come for any station. It's not about you." I told her I knew that, and it was the reason none of this had ever felt like revenge while it was happening. The front arrived that afternoon at 3:10, and it arrived meaner and earlier on our side of the ridge than anywhere else in the county, which is the entire reason Station 14 exists. The sky over the western hills went from white to the color of a nickel in about 20 minutes. Station 14 recorded a pressure fall of nearly 4 millibars inside a half hour, and it clocked a sustained wind of 38 miles an hour with a gust to 61 at 3:22 in the afternoon. At that same minute, the airport station east of the ridge was reporting 19 miles an hour and light rain. 2 numbers 22 miles apart, describing 2 different afternoons. That gap is not a curiosity. That gap is the whole argument. The county used that local reading, along with radar and the surrounding network, to determine that the western half of the county was getting hit harder and sooner than the broader guidance suggested, and they pushed a targeted warning out ahead of the schedule the regional data alone would have supported. Every phone in Briar Glen Estates went off at 3:26 in the afternoon with that flat electronic tone that makes your stomach drop no matter how many times you have heard it. Nothing catastrophic happened here. There was no tornado, nobody died, nobody was even injured. We got 2¼ inches of rain in 50 minutes, a wind that stripped limbs off the maples on the boulevard and laid a 40-year-old silver poplar across the corner of Halsey Court, and a power outage on the west side of the neighborhood that lasted a little under 5 hours. But people got those alerts 11 minutes before the worst of it, and 11 minutes is enough to bring a child inside, to move a car out from under a poplar, to get down the hall away from the windows, to pull a grill cover off a propane tank. Mrs. Delacroix, who is 81 and who never once complained about the ugly mast 40 feet from her fence line, got her wind chimes and her folding chairs into the garage and closed the door with about 4 minutes to spare. I know because she told me the next week, and she did not know at the time what the alert had to do with the thing behind my house, and I did not tell her. Diane Hargrove's phone went off at 3:26 that afternoon, along with every other phone in Briar Glen Estates. I sat in my own kitchen with the lights out and the wind driving rain flat against the window glass, and I thought about her leaning out of a car window, telling me I could put a weather application on my phone like a normal person. The applications on our phones are downstream. All of it is built on top of ground truth collected by ugly galvanized masts standing in the back corners of ordinary people's yards. The very thing she demanded I remove was one of the reasons her phone knew to scream at her. Some ironies do their own work and do not require assistance. Grant Ellison called me a little after 8 that night. He said Station 14 had performed perfectly and that the West Valley readings had been the cleanest early indicator they had. I told him I supposed the station still had not gotten any prettier. He laughed once, short and dry, and said, "It doesn't need to be pretty." The association called a special meeting the following Thursday, and the clubhouse could not hold everybody. They ran out of folding chairs at 40, and people stood 3 deep along the back wall and out into the corridor. Word had traveled the way it always does, and by then the residents of Briar Glen Estates had a list of questions that had nothing to do with me. Why had association funds paid a removal contractor to abate a county installation? Why had the association's own attorney not been given the parcel documents before drafting a violation letter? Why was there a decorative gate sitting inside a recorded emergency access easement? And the question that had every homeowner in that room leaning forward, which was how much all of this was going to cost the association to fix. Diane opened by calling it a misunderstanding between the association and a homeowner. She used the word unfortunate twice in her first 30 seconds. She said that with better communication from all parties, the situation could have been avoided, and she looked at me when she said all parties because she had committed fully to her version and there was nowhere left for her to go. I stood up. I had thought about giving a speech and I had written one and I had thrown it away because I have never in my life seen a long speech beat a short document. I walked to the front with a manila folder and laid 4 things on the table one at a time where the board and the front rows could see them. The 3 emails in which I told her to check the land records. The recorded easement with the county clerk's stamp and its date. The fine notice for $250 a day with her signature on it. And the work authorization for Clearview Landscape and Removal, also with her signature on it. A misunderstanding is when 2 people don't have enough information, I said. I told her 3 times exactly where the information was. She decided she didn't need to read it. You could hear the air conditioning. 40-some people in a room, and not one chair creaked. Diane's started to answer, and Caleb Sloan put a hand flat on the table, which is the polite version of a lawyer telling his client to stop talking, and then Caleb went through the consequences item by item in front of everybody. Every fine assessed against me was void and would be rescinded in writing. The association would bear the contractor's cancellation costs, the county's documentation and inspection costs, and the legal fees already incurred, and there would be more of those. The gate, the fencing, and the planters inside the access corridor had to be removed or relocated at association expense, which the contractor's rough estimate put somewhere north of $19,000. And the association's governing procedures would be amended because a board president had been able to authorize enforcement action, retain a contractor, and commit reserve funds against a recorded county encumbrance without a single legal review. Ray Whitaker made the motion. He did not make a speech either. He said that the board had a duty to the community and that the community had just watched the board fail it, and then he moved to remove Diane Hargrove from the office of president. Marla Dunn seconded it before he had finished the sentence. There was no shouting. Nobody was escorted anywhere, nobody was arrested, no security was called, and I want to say plainly that I did not want any of that and would not have enjoyed it. Diane simply sat in the same chair at the center of the same long table where she had told a room full of her neighbors that I was not above the rules, and she listened while Marla read the vote aloud, name by name, and the count went against her by a margin that was not close. The corridor got cleared over the following 3 weeks. The gate came out and went back in 11 feet farther north with a wider opening. The stone piers were rebuilt outside the easement line, and the planters ended up along the boulevard where they honestly look better than they ever did back there. The association adopted a new standing rule, printed in the newsletter in bold, requiring that any proposed action touching a utility, an easement, or any infrastructure receive legal review and a documented parcel records search before enforcement of any kind is initiated. It is 1 paragraph long. It would have cost the association $19,000 less to have written it a year earlier. Diane Hargrove is not on the board. I am told she still lives in Briar Glen, and I see her vehicle sometimes, and she does not slow down at the curve anymore. I was asked twice whether I would take a board seat myself, and both times I said no, and I meant it both times. I did not want her chair. I never wanted her chair. Wanting that chair was her whole problem. A few weeks after the storm, I went out back on a cool, bright morning with my coffee and brushed a scatter of dry leaves off the rain gauge funnel, the same small chore I have done 100 times. Tessa Monroe's truck was parked at the end of the cleared corridor because she had just finished a quarterly calibration, and she raised a hand at me and I raised mine back. The mast stood exactly where it has stood for 8 years, on the same concrete pad, with a fresh anchor plate the county installed to replace the one with the pry bar mark in it. Still galvanized. Still 10 feet of unlovely steel with a blinking green diode. Still not approved by anyone's architectural committee and never once needing to be. I stood there and watched the anemometer cups turn in a light southwest wind, and here is what I had figured out by then. Diane spent weeks trying to prove that no one man gets to stand above the rules of a homeowners association. What she never once considered is that the association does not stand above the county land records, and it does not stand above a recorded easement, and it certainly does not stand above the emergency warning system of an entire county. In the end, the only thing Diane Hargrove ever successfully moved out of Briar Glen Estates was not Station 14. It was her own chair.